Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host Steve Hall and I am welcomed by Lyle McDonald here today. Hopefully all of you know who Lyle is. He has been on the podcast twice already and we talked about refeeds and avoiding fat regain after a diet, and those podcasts went down very, very well, and you guys have requested Lyle to come on again. He's been very busy authoring some new fantastic books, including the female book, and has been on tons of podcasts talking about that already, and that isn't what we're going to be talking about today, but I'm sure if you're interested in that, you can go and purchase Lyle's book and also listen to all the podcasts. Today we're going to be talking about something that I think many of you will know about and some of you won't, and that is Lyle McDonald's generic bulking routine, which I think I've actually done in the past and I've used, and I think it's a great routine, and I don't think there are many great routines freely available online, so it's nice that this one's here, and I think we could delve into it and find some great explanation behind it. So my first question to you, Lyle, is, how are you first of all?
I'm fine. I mentioned before we started, if people are having any trouble understanding me, I had some dental work done, and so there's a little bit of weirdness going on, but I will do my best to talk around this stupid mouthpiece. Basically, I actually, believe it or not, have done a little bit of work on volume 2 of the women's book, which is gonna be on training. I have a tendency to take long periods of time between big projects, but this one I can't wait 3 more years, so I have been delving into that, so that's keeping me a little bit busy. Hopefully it won't be quite as complicated and exhausting as the first one was. So, but no, everything's fine other than that. It's funny, I very rarely actually get asked to talk about training. I actually started in exercise physiology, but I sort of just got established as the nutrition and fat loss guy. So training is something certainly that's always been, a huge interest to me. It's actually what got me into this field, because I was just an athlete that wanted to be better. Mm-hmm. And, like every 15-year-old wanted to be big, like every 15-year-old male that's ever existed. So all that stuff was always of interest to me. It just kind of got put on the back burner. And so I know we had talked about sort of that specific routine, something I drew up many, many, many years ago. And I think maybe even sort of training across a career, which is something, I think isn't really addressed, other than it's given very much lip service. You tend to see a lot of what's online either rank beginners sometimes or very advanced. And, there's a joke, everyone on the internet is advanced, except that they're not. Everyone thinks they train harder than any 10 men and that they are an advanced trainee, and that is usually not the case. And I think you see a lot of people who are maybe reached an advanced level, who are writers, who are writing very much about their own training experience now. And it's led all of us down a bad road. Back in the Muscle Magazine days, you're a new lifter, you see what some top pro is doing now, go, well, I want to be like him. Endurance athletes do it too. If I want to be like Lance Armstrong, I'm going to do his training. Right, well, took him 2 decades to get to that, plus everything else going on. And I think people frequently miss, not only a proper beginning training stage, which is really what sets your base for that important intermediate. And I would say most people online are probably closer to intermediate than not. By the time you get to advanced, a lot of things are changing in terms of, we talk about expectations. So, we could maybe even start there before we get to that. Because that generic bulking routine is very much an intermediate type of program. It's like, all right, I'm going to assume you've gotten through the beginner stage properly, which is often a poor assumption. I've worked with people that have been training for 10 or more years, and very more technically than anything, had to take them back to almost the beginner stage. Wow. Because it is possible to train incorrectly for 10 years. There's a lot of people that do it that very realistically could go back to, maybe an advanced intermediate program, but certainly much less advanced than what they're using. And it's amazing. Suddenly they start getting results because they are now training. You'll hear people talk about training age and biological age, and you can have trained for 10 years, but if you were training like crap the whole time, you might still in some ways be a beginner. and need to go all the way back for at least some period of time. It's also always funny you hear about these advanced guys who've been doing these crazy body part splits and supersets and this, and every once in a while they'll talk about going back to the basics, and they'll go back to how they trained, in their earlier part of the career, and suddenly they start growing again. And I think there's lessons to be learned from that. So that's also like we could possibly talk about.
No, I think that sets the stage for a really exciting conversation. And I often think about the names that we give them, like novice, intermediate, advanced, and advanced just sound so much better. And I almost wish they were called like young, middle-aged, and old. And no one wants to be old. You don't want to be an old lifter, so maybe that would help.
It's funny, they did that with marketing, right? It used to be like gold, silver, bronze, and then nobody liked bronze. That's like the second loser. And then they suddenly changed the names, and suddenly it was like gold, platinum, titanium. Suddenly the lowest level. And it's funny, but frequently just renaming it absolutely has that effect. So like, I'm not a beginner, I don't know what you would call it, but it's just like, no, think about it as you're an accelerated potential trainee. Like you're in that stage where you can really make super fat. And maybe you're right, maybe reframing it in a positive terminology would get people to stop being, feeling bad that they're beginners. It's like, well, everybody started somewhere. I think that's also a danger. You see this a lot of, trainers at gyms and even the people who write about it. We forget that everybody starts somewhere, right? It's really easy to be judgmental. When I did it, trust me, I'm no better than anyone else, when I was younger especially. Like, it's really easy to see people online and go, how can you not know this? And then I look back at stuff that I did in my teens and go, yeah, that's how. Because there's a lot of bad information, and you can't know what you don't know. But I do think there's so much negativity around being a beginner, nobody wants to really go. And it's boring. Like the stuff you do as a beginner, and even as intermediate, it's not sexy training. You can't write an article every week about new techniques to use. And really, you just need to be putting in the time. I think if more people saw what top athletes in every sport did, probably including bodybuilding, they would be very bored by it.
Yeah.
Because there's rarely anything that special or fancy or complicated. It's a matter of just putting in the work consistently over time. That doesn't get website hits, and that doesn't sell product. And those aren't fun articles to read. They're not exciting. Anyway.
Not at all. And actually, I think what might be a nice place to start, because we've kind of talked about the novice, intermediate, advanced. How are you defining these yourself, Lyle? How are you naming each of these?
I tend to look at it. I know, some people use like strength gains. Mm-hmm. Usually, if they're very strength focused, I tend to look at it just mostly in terms of time of productive training. Like I would say, a beginner has probably anywhere from the first day they're in the gym to maybe the 6-month mark of proper consistent training. And we'll kind of define what that means. You might stretch that out to a year. I think if you look at probably the growth response, and like Alan Aragon, Eric Helms, I actually don't know who developed the model that they use and that I've just ripped off wholeheartedly. They use a year one, you can gain, 1 to 1.5% of body weight, and then in year 2 it drops a little bit, and in year 3. And I mean, these are all arbitrary cutoffs. Is it 6 months? Is it like, usually within that year you're going to make the fastest gains, again, assuming consistent productive training. From year 1 to year 2, you're certainly intermediate. And at some point, you might divide between the beginning, early intermediate, and an advanced intermediate stage. And a lot of that will be in terms of how much training you can even, like how much heavy training you can do in a week, volume capacity. And then once you get to the 2, I would say intermediate, you can run from 1 to maybe even 3 years. I think you can still see some pretty, by year 3 of proper training, any athlete is going to be getting pretty damn close to how far they're ever going to get. Mm-hmm. There's that horrible asymptotic curve, of if here's your genetic potential. Where's my camera not on? There we go. Here's your genetic potential, the results are amazing. And then by the time you're here, it's just that getting that last 5 or 10% can take the rest of your career, which also has some implications for expectations we can come back to, in the sense of, if your goal is to be 220 pounds lean, like to be a super heavyweight bodybuilder, and after 3 years of productive training, you're still 30 pounds from that, you're not going to make it.
Yeah.
Not naturally, like just period, right? If you're an endurance athlete, if you're not Cat 1, if you're not Category 1 or getting close to it by your third or fourth year of training, you're not going to be an elite cyclist. Like, I don't care how many more years you put it, like, that's just the nature of adaptation. So I would personally say, 0 to 6 months, maybe 0 to a year is a beginner. And again, early beginner, late beginner stage, like the 6 month mark, you're getting into some serious training. From year 1 to year 3, I would call them intermediate, and we might subdivide that, year 1 to year 2, early intermediate, year 2 to year 3, you should be getting pretty strong, getting pretty close to your limits. From year 3 on, assuming those 2 to 3 years of productive, consistent training, I would consider you advanced. So that would be my arbitrary cutoffs, which fit with Alan and Eric's model in terms of, what we could expect in terms of real world muscle gains. Yeah. I think.
No, I think that was a good definition. And I guess the thing I think you were going to define is kind of productive training. I think that would be really helpful for the listeners to actually know what that is, because I think some of them will think they're training productively and might not be, and then others will just be doing exactly that. Sure.
The way I tend to look at it, and this gets way back in the day, right? So early internet days, we're talking late 90s, when this all first started, and there was still this claim of we don't really know what makes muscle grow. And that was basically a cop-out to say you can do any old damn thing you want to do in the gym. It was a way to see, I know what works for me version of that, which is just an excuse to say, I don't give a damn what you think or what science says is right. I know what works for that. That's all that is. And even then we did actually know most of it. All right, there's a classic paper that I love to refer people to by Goldfink in, I want to say, the early 80s. And it was called The Mechanism of Work-Induced Hypertrophy. And it basically was what makes muscle grow. And in short, it was progressive tension overload. Right? And if you look at, Brad Schoenfeld has a very recent review paper, recent, last 4 or 5 years. The man's so prolific, I can't keep track of one. He publishes a paper every week. And it's basically, the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy. And it's, we know it's tension, like muscular tension overload. Fatigue may play a role in terms of metabolite accumulation, et cetera, eccentric muscle damage. And then the hormonal response is at best moderate. And just because I just want to be like this, when I wrote my first book in 1998 on the ketogenic diet, the model of hypertrophy I basically put out was progressive tension overload, fatigue, muscle damage, hormones. So just saying. I'm not saying Brad ripped me off. I'm just saying. He didn't. We were just looking at the same data set, and this is what falls out of it, right? So we can quibble about sets and intensities and volumes and frequency, and we'll talk about that. But really, the key factor in training is not volume, despite what everybody is saying. And that's a whole separate podcast for me to complain about, this volume is king thing. Progressive tension overload, right? If over time, and I don't mean workout to workout, I don't mean set to set, I don't necessarily mean week to week. If over time you are not progressively overloading the muscle, predominantly in attention, and yes, we can use volume overload, we can use density overload acutely, because especially at the more advanced level, you can't just keep adding weight to the bar. Like, you get to a point where, if that were true, powerlifters wouldn't take 16 weeks to gain 2.5 kilos on their total, right? You can't just keep using linear progression. Yeah. But for a while, you can do a lot of that. So to me, progressive proper training in this definition is, well, number one, it's using exercises that are appropriate for your body, that target the muscles, done properly. And even that is a big place people go wrong. Yeah. Like I said, I had a trainee years ago. He'd been training 20 years. His technique on everything was awful. I mean, nothing exercise done properly. He didn't know. I mean, he was older than I was. He came up when there was no information out there. And we basically had to rebuild his technique from scratch. I mean, he was strong. He moved a lot of weight. And you see that is you'll see a guy who's just heave-hoeing the weight and using terrible technique, maybe moving big weights, but they're like, why am I not developing? And you teach them proper technique, you cut the weight in half, and so they can actually feel their back muscles working or whatever it is. And suddenly you're like, oh, holy crap, I'm growing now.
Yeah.
Now, that brings up a separate, we can come, maybe if I remember to come back to it, about tension and weight on the bar and how they're not really the same thing, but that's sort of a sub-discussion I'll come back to. But the point of this being that, like, to me, productive training is, training consistency, obviously, but using proper technique with exercises that are appropriate for you. And we'll talk about exercise selection a little bit, probably get the generic bulking routine because that's where I make some changes to it. But training progressively over time, right? Go into every gym. You can go in your gym today and just pick out some dude and look at what he's got on the bar and come back in a year and it's probably the same way. That is not training productively. That is not training progressively. Everything else is secondary to that, right? If your listeners are familiar with Dante Trudell, dog crap training, which kind of had a brief moment in the sun. I don't think it's talked about as much now as it should be. And among other things, right, he had a reputation for taking guys that weren't growing and getting them growing again. And he had I know Dante, he's a friend and as much as anyone on the internet is a friend. Runs an excellent True Protein source, True Protein website. And dog crap, it's based around rest pause, loaded stretching, some exercise variation, some other things like that. And everyone was like, oh my God, this training system is brilliant. And it is. It's very well thought out. But the big thing I think he did is he took a bunch of bodybuilders who were focusing on the pump and the squeeze and this and being tired, and he said, beat your records. His big focus was, every day in the gym, you're trying to beat your previous weeks, whether it's the weight on the bar, whether it's the number of repetitions, no matter what it is. Hidden within his system was the key variable, train progressively. Because if you're not getting stronger over time, you're not getting bigger, period. So those are really kind of the key variables to that. And again, yes, you reach a point where you may not be adding weight. Certainly not workout to workout, possibly not even week to week. It may be month to month, possibly less than that. I think for bodybuilding, it's not quite like a strength power athlete, but it still has to be occurring over time. And I think if you look at the biggest natural bodybuilders, almost without exception, they're very strong. Yeah. Right now, they may not be powerlifter strong, right? They may not be 1 rep maximum strong. But relatively speaking, for their body size, they're extreme. A guy in my Facebook group a couple of years ago that came up, and he was like, I don't know, I'm pretty big. I don't think I'm very strong. I'm like, really? What are your numbers? And he was like, over 400 for reps in the squat, over 300 for reps in the bench, over 5 in the deadlift. I'm like, dude, that's strong. Go look at the average gym. Go look at the number of legitimate 315-pound, 140-ish 150-ish kilo bench presses that are not being made by behemoths. Like, yeah, there's the big 300-pound guys that it's still body weight or whatever. But, like, look at the number of legitimate 300-pound squats, the number of legitimate, even close to parallel 400-pound squats for reps. That is strong. No, that's not an 800-pound powerlifting squat, but for a natural who weighs 180 to 200 pounds, that's strong as hell, right? My old training partner, who was 5'5", tall and square, he was just a little fire plug. I watched him do 315 by 20 in the squat. He singled over 400. He deadlifted over 500. Eric Hell, and you find that a lot of the top natural bodybuilders cross over to powerlifting, and there's a reason for that. Kind of just finishing this up, I have often found it ironic that powerlifters frequently grow better than bodybuilders. Maybe not so much in modern age, but certainly for a time, like you look at powerlifters, these guys carry some muscle, maybe not balanced depending on their routine, where it's like powerlifters were growing and a lot of the bodybuilders in the gym weren't. And I think the reason is that powerlifting has at its core progression. Yeah. The goal of powerlifting is to add weight to the bar over time. So many bodybuilders got caught up in the squeeze and the pump and just make sure they walked out of the gym tired that they forgot to add weight to the bar. And, there used to be power building routines where guys, like the focus was on heavy set to 5 progressive, and then you did your pump work afterwards. We'll talk about that too, because there's much logic to that. But the guys who had progression built into their training were the ones who were growing, which is and I just always kind of felt that was kind of ironic. It's like if bodybuilders trained mentally more like powerlifters, they would be growing a lot better. And I think that's why you see a lot of powerlifters, when they get sick of beating themselves up, switch to bodybuilding and just kill it, because they're so freaking strong in low rep ranges that now they can use really incredible weights for moderate rep ranges. You can squat 600 for a single, 405 for reps is kind of nothing. That's one of your warm-up weights. So anyway, that's kind of how I would define the long way around, productive training. Appropriate exercise selection for you. Sufficient volume, frequency, but progression. If you're not getting stronger over time, you're not training productively.
Mm-hmm. I guess this is where some of the issues can lie with the more novice athletes looking towards the advanced athletes who can't progress with load progressively that fast. So they're using these other techniques. So then the more novice people aren't chasing progression that they could be chasing, and they're going for these wrong aspects for them because it's just not ideal.
And I think a lot of it, there's kind of been this idea, and Louis Simmons was probably one of the ones who kind of put this out there, that the old linear progression, the old idea that you kind of started here and ended here didn't work. And it's not true. There's still a rather large number of powerlifters who train very much in that fashion. If you look at their routines, there's also the matter of time. Right? No, am I going to expect someone to add weight linearly to the bar for 12 months straight? Of course not. That's probably not realistic. For a beginner might do it. Most people will not. But what was this came out of all these old school annual periodization plans where you did a year to one peak. And then we started compressing that. And even the old 16-week periodization models, right? You would start with 15s and then go to 10s and then go to 6s. And it didn't work for him. I don't think it worked for a lot of strength athletes, because doing 15s in the squat doesn't help your max. Mm-hmm. Whatever, but over limited time frames, almost anybody can add weight to the bar. Now, it may not be long, right? If you're an advanced guy, you're not going to have 12 straight weeks of adding weight to the bar. But if you can really get a good run up and apply yourself, you might do it for 4 to 6. Right, so I do think we start getting into differences of time frame between beginner, intermediate, and advanced. A beginner may very well add weight to the bar for 6 months, the first 6 months of their training. And it may slow down. They may get it for a year, depending. Once you get to the intermediate stage, you might only be able to do that very consistently for 8 to 12 weeks before you kind of hit a wall. Once you get to the advanced stage, you might be able to pull it off for 3 to 4 weeks. Right? Even if you look at Louis Simmons, the powerlifting stuff, the way they programmed max effort and dynamic effort work, it was linear for 3 weeks, and then they would drop back and they'd pick a new movement, or they would for a few weeks you can do it, and then you might need a back cycle. I think that even gets into a separate issue. I had this theory. Well, it's a couple different things, right? Why can't we add weight to the bar every week? Why? In premise, if you're getting stronger, to some degree, let's say you train and the next week you're 0.5% stronger. In premise, you should, however, we're limited by fitness fatigue theory, whatever. I think we're mainly limited by the practical weight increases we have on the bar. Right? If the smallest weight you can add is, 2.5 pounds, well, usually it's 5, 2.5 pounds per side, 1.25 kilos per side. Suddenly, the weight on the bar, the rate of increase on the bar starts to rapidly outstrip whatever small strength gains you were making. I think, and of course, we've got noise, there's variability in plates. I realize your strength would never be going up, but I think in premise, if we could completely match, but you'd be dealing with, 0.1% added to the bar. You're dealing with unless you have completely, meticulously weighed out weights. I think we run into practical issues with that. It's a separate question I've been thinking about. Somebody asked me, why is it easier to add weight to compound movements than isolation movements? Mm-hmm. I don't think that's true. I think it's true practically because compound movements allow heavy weights, so that the weight increases are a smaller percentage of what's on the bar. But in a bench press, if my chest gets stronger, my triceps don't, technically it should be harder because something's going to be limiting. Whereas if I'm doing a fly and my pecs are getting stronger, if they've gotten 1% stronger, I should be able to do more weight. But if the smallest weight increase on the stack is 5%, it will seem harder, but I don't know that it I don't know if I completely agree with myself on this one yet, but I actually don't know if it's the case that it's easier with compound movements from a physiological sense. I think it's easier in a practical sense, but that's kind of getting it beside that. So the point of this all being that, yes, linear only works. You see these guys who are like, for 6 weeks I'm doing volume, I'm keeping the weight the same, or I'm keeping the weight slightly submaximal, and I'm jumping my volume. And that's something Brad Schoenfeld uses with people because he trains at advanced levels. Because you can't just keep slapping weight on the bar. I mean, even with micro plates, and I used to have a set. I used to have, my little quarter-pound discs and my half-pound and my three-quarter-pound, and they're great. They're great for female trainees, and you can keep grinding out gains when you're only adding a pound to the bar for seemingly forever. Of course, when your plates aren't weighed out and the plates have a 3-pound variance either direction, suddenly you don't really know what you're lifting unless you're using the exact same plates or something. But yeah, so I think a lot of that is really an issue of time frame. And to your point, looking at what an advanced guy doing is for 6 weeks, I am just focusing on, squeezing and good muscular contraction, getting the volume in. They're at a point where adding 5 pounds to the bar every week is just not realistic.
No, definitely. And actually, I think I wonder what your thoughts are on, I think it was Brian Miner who made a comment about when you add weight to the bar, that's not a requirement for progressive overload, but it's more a consequence of the fact you've been growing and you can now use that weight on the bar.
Yeah, I've seen that kind of argued. There's the one way to look at it is that adding weight to the bar triggers strength. It triggers the growth response. And others will argue that being able to add weight to the bar is a consequence of having grown. And I think I see where they're going with that, and I think it's kind of just semantics, but I think it's both, right? It's like you have to challenge the muscle progressively so that it grows, which then allows you to use heavier weight, more volume, whatever it is, which then allows you to get another growth response. I think I would say it's hard to tell which is driving which. I actually remember Charlie Francis, right, the sprint coach, talked about, his sprinters all got very, very, very strong in the weight room. And and the idea was, because they got stronger is why they ran faster. And he goes, no, actually, he believes it was the other way around, was that as their sprint speeds went up, that. But I think it's both are driving the bus in a very cyclical fashion. It's yes, we have to overload the muscle till the point that it sees a growth response, which now allows us to overload it to a greater level, which will then drive a further growth. So I think it's just kind of a big, weird spiral upwards. I do think it brings up the point, though, that there is a point, or trainees reach a situation where adding weight to the bar in the short term may not be the best way to apply progression, or to apply overload, rather. Obviously, adding weight to the bar is progression, but if you get to the point you can't do that, you may have to use other methods of progression, such as volume or shortened rest periods, which is density training, or higher frequency, or whatever it is, as a way to overload within the poundages you can currently use to get the growth response that will then. So I can see it in that sense, certainly, from a practical standpoint down the road.
Yeah, I guess it's more of a interesting thought for someone who is more advanced, because that's where it becomes more important to have other elements of progression.
And I think I think that could get into a big discussion of fitness fatigue theory, and I've seen this addressed in a lot of endurance sports, right? Because the old model was supercompensation. We train, we get tired, we get stronger. We train, we get tired, we get stronger, and that in a practical sense that works for beginners. Right? You train Monday, you're a little stronger Wednesday, you're a little trained, you're a little stronger Friday. But we kind of know that that's not really what's going on, because it doesn't work beyond a certain point. And so you see the situation in endurance sports where they're all right, we're going to have to hammer our guys for 2 weeks. We're going to train them every single day. Swimming does this. And they'll just bury them in volume within the speeds they can currently do to generate hopefully an adaptive, fitness response that's being masked by fatigue, or however you want to look at it. And then they talk about, if they did that long term, they'd eventually blow up. But you do that for a couple of weeks, and you get this big dip. And when you cut the training down, suddenly they go back and recover. And we talk about sort of my advanced approach with specialization cycles. I'll touch on that again. But yeah, there is that situation where to be able to add weight to the bar in a month, you're going to have to bury yourself in volume or frequency or whatever as your acute overload.
Mm-hmm. No, fantastic. And actually, you brought up a question that I wasn't particularly going to ask, but I've actually asked it to quite a few of the kind of Brett Contreras answered it recently. Brad Schoenfeld did as well. And Eric and Mike Israetel all have different viewpoints on whether kind of functional overreaching is a beneficial thing or maybe even a requirement for some people for hypertrophy. And I'd love to hear what your viewpoint is on that, Lyle.
I suppose at a super advanced level, like I know I've talked to Brad about this, and I know he will do that. I think you said it's like the end of his training cycles where he'll just, for 2 or 3 weeks at the very tail end, he will just bury people in volume. I want to say up to like 30 sets per week per muscle group, like really jack it up right before the very end, right before the tail end where you pull it back. I think that certainly has potential. I've always been more conservative with that, and I think this reflects a difference between people who are training hands-on and people who are writing. When I train people hands-on, I will frequently do very different things than what I might suggest writing. Not that I'm giving different advice. It's when I write something, I have to predict how badly someone's going to screw it up.
Yeah. And
after 25 years, I've got a pretty good idea. If I'm training someone where I can control the adjustments, and when I have that control over it, the problem from a practical standpoint, if you tell someone, if you bury yourself in volume for 2 or 3 weeks and then pull back, you'll get a growth response, they won't ever pull back.
Yeah.
That's what I've just seen in a practical sense. Give me one moment, my doctor. So I think practically the danger is people blowing themselves out of the water. I think physiologically they're certainly at the advanced levels. And here we are truly talking at the advanced level, right, where you're not making strength gains week to week, maybe even month to month. Mm-hmm. You have to find some way to truly overload the system, but you have to do it in a very intelligent, if you have the wherewithal and the ability to limit it to 2 weeks tops, I think it can be very effective. The problem is you don't usually see the consequences of that immediately. You feel great for a couple of weeks, and you go a couple more weeks, and then suddenly the wheels fall off.
Yeah.
There's a piece I have on my website, something I did before I went to speed skate, and it's called The Hardest Training I've Ever Done. I basically had 6 weeks. I had been an endurance skater and was moving to ice speed skating, which requires a lot more strength. So I'd been weight training for a while, and I had basically 6 weeks to rebuild as much strength as humanly possible. And I knew that for about that long, I could destroy myself. So I lifted full body 4 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. I did jump training on Wednesday and Saturday. I did aerobic training and technical stuff in the evening, and I took Sundays off. Every third week, I would drop the Friday, Saturday workout, and I made basically linear gains. Like I started with probably the bar. Like I ended up squatting, 85% of what I had ever done best, but I knew from personal experience that I could tolerate that like for 6 weeks, you can do amazing things. Mm-hmm. And if you try to continue that, you explode or get injured or whatever. So yeah, for very short periods of time, I think absolutely that. And it may not only be beneficial, you may reach a point where it's required.
Yeah. Cool.
I think that we could probably debate, that was, was it practical programming? I think, you used to see people write about, you had your standard microcycle of training, and you had a shock microcycle. Sif and Verkashansky used to write about that. Mm-hmm. And the double shock microcycle, which was like too heavy. But nobody ever really laid it out. It was this very conceptual thing. And Glenn Penley and Rip Patel, and I forget who the third author was on practical programming, actually gave a practical example of how to do this. And it was really fantastic because it actually laid it. And it was like 2 weeks of break-in training, 2 weeks of just trying to murder your guy, like literally just destroying him. And this is Olympic lifting, I believe. And then it was going to be 4 weeks before you were able to see whether it worked or not. And that's the kind of training, thing that you're looking at. And the problem is most athletes aren't patient, and bodybuilders, I don't know if they're more so or less so than everybody else, but, to tell them you can blow yourself out for 2 weeks, but then you need to take 4 easy weeks doesn't scan well. It's a very tough sell. It's the same reason when Brian Haycock was developing hypertrophy-specific training so many years ago. the idea was that, you trained higher frequency, lower volume, and that you used various supplements, that only like 1 out of every 6 workouts was particularly heavy. And I said, it doesn't matter if this is the best way to train or not. Nobody's going to do it. I go, most trainees are not going to accept that much submaximal work. Mm-hmm. They might now, because we've seen a really radical shift in how people conceptualize training, at least online. But at the time, like, dude, bodybuilders know one way to train, which is go heavy or go home. If you're not killing yourself, it's not a workout, you're not going to get most people to do this, which is ultimately the other issue. So more practical one. It is the reality, right? There is the issue of training. We can argue about the best, coaches will tell you this anytime. You're better off having an athlete that believes in less than optimal training than an athlete that doesn't believe in the best workout ever, because working harder on something that's not as good will work better than not believing in something that may be better. So that's a big part of a lot of this.
I absolutely agree. I see it actually, and I think it might have been Bryce Lewis who spoke about kind of you could give 2 trainees the same program. One could be from like a top class coach, the other could be like a generic program online, and the person with a top class coach would do better because they have belief, which I think the psychology within lifting is huge.
Oh, it's true. It's so many things. You're way too young to remember this. Back in the 90s, there was a nutrition and training program called Cybergenics. And it was basically a way to sell supplement line. The stuff was awful. Everybody my age tried it. The supplements were disgusting. And it was the most ridiculous training you've ever seen. Like, if you could survive it, I have no doubt that it worked. Like, one of the leg workouts was something like squat 8 reps to failure, go to the leg press, go to the leg extension machine, go do 20 box jumps. This is all on like no rest. And then repeat that 4 times. Like, that was a giant, right? But then they sold all these super expensive supplements to go along with it. And a lot of it was like, well, if you've invested the money in this, you're going to believe in the training. And it was like, the training doesn't even have to be good if you work hard enough at it, within realms. There was an old strength coach named, I believe it was Steve Plisk, and he was a collegiate strength coach. He said, we've tried every model, we've tried every periodization scheme, we've tried it all. And what we found is the most important thing is to work hard consistently over time. Like you're dealing with percentage differences over time. And that's, a lot of the argument that's going on right now about frequency and volume and all this and all that and all the other, to a degree is important in the short term. Like, I think the short-term responses will be better in terms of growth or strength for optimal versus suboptimal. And over a career, a lot of this stuff, because you're only getting as big as you're getting. I believe it was Arthur Jones who said, by the time you can barbell curl 225 pounds, no matter how you get there, your arms will be big enough for anything short of wrestling a bear. And there's much truth to that, right? As if over however many years your training gets you to what's your genetic limit or whatever, how much you can move for moderate reps, you're probably going to do better. Now, the issue becomes that not all training is going to be sufficient to keep you progressing towards that. But to a great degree, a lot of these things that we argue about, they're fun to argue about. Yeah. However, it starts to kind of come out in the wash. There's too many different ways to, and I've long looked at the commonalities of training. Like, okay, the successful training programs, what do they have in common? Yeah. Not what do they have that's different. Let's not worry about the details, worry about the commonalities. And I think, like, if you look at all successful diets, whether it's calorie counting, portion counting, whatever it is, get the person to eat less consistently over time and keep them full. Doesn't matter how you achieve that. There's different ways. Same thing. If you look at all productive training programs for naturals, throw drugs in the mix, doesn't matter. Take enough drugs, you'll grow. I don't give a shit what you do, honestly. But for natural, like I said, if you look at the best natural bodybuilders, they're usually the strongest guys in the gym, or they're very strong, maybe in moderate repetition ranges. Yeah. They're not powerlifter strong, because they don't practice the skill of a 1 rep repetition, 1 rep maximum. But the weights that they're using for moderate repetition sets are very, very, very heavy compared to most other people, and there's a reason for that. And any, regardless of whether you talk to myself, Mike, Brad, Brett, Eric, I think you'll find that every single one of us, within whatever frequency, volume, intensity schema that we use, Dante, the goal at the end of the day is still progression over time. Yeah. right? Even without getting off on this rant, right? So Brad's papers are being held up as, they prove that volume is all that matters. Well, that's true if you read the abstract. However, and look, I like Brad. Brad, I talk all the time. And this isn't a criticism of Brad. This is criticism of people who haven't read the studies. In all of his studies, there's 2 factors that are built into it. Well, 3. Every workout is supervised. He pushes these guys to their limits, and they progress over time. Now, yes, within those 3 variables, volume starts to become a larger driver on things. But by that point, all we've done is qualify that, well, within the context of proper training to begin with, which is showing up, working hard, and adding weight to the bar, volume plays a separate role. But these are the key factors that, I will always take a guy doing 2 sets of 10 progressively over time, getting stronger, will grow better than the guy doing 10 sets who uses the same weight a year from now. I guarantee you, volume is not king unless we assume these other things. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is king loss. So when you start to look at the commonalities, and there is a truth to it. If you don't believe in hypertrophy-specific training, I don't care how good it is, you won't do it. If you don't believe in my generic, and that's fine. It is one way. It is how I parsed the data set at the time to develop what I thought would be optimal for the majority of people. And I realized there are outliers. Some people like a little bit higher frequency. Some people still like the 1 day a week bro splits, which I used to not think much of, and I've certainly adjusted my opinion based on some of Brad's data. Even the meta-analyses are being kind of taken out of context right now. Even Brad's original paper said twice a week was still better than once. Mm-hmm. The new studies, the new meta-analysis says that for strength, it doesn't matter if the frequency doesn't matter if volume is equated, except for compound versus single joint, upper versus lower body, and women versus men, in which case higher frequency was better, at which point I would say that the claim of no better is being stretched to kind of its limits. If higher frequency is better for compound movements, upper body and women versus single, lower body and men, well, then I got news for you. Higher frequency is still better under most, And I will also argue that if we accept that adding weight to the bar and getting stronger is what drives hypertrophy, or as a consequence of it, if a higher frequency means better strength gains, well, I got bad news for you. Then a higher frequency equals better growth down the road.
Yeah.
Anyway, we got way off topic. Yes, I do agree that those high volume phases done properly, that functional overreaching, it's just the athlete or their coach has to be very attentive and not let them, and save them from themselves. Let's just put it that way.
No, I actually want to reflect a little bit on one of the comments you did make, because you talked about kind of the idea that volume is king for hypertrophy, and that's the kind of what people are ending up doing. And I'm seeing it like with people I'm interacting with and kind of younger trainees that I'm trying to help grow. They're kind of skipping a boat and they're just focusing on volume and doing loads and loads of sets of weights, and it's just ending up being junk volume, and they're not aiming to progress, and they're getting into a state of kind of panic when they're told you need to reduce this, and they're like, no, but volume's king. It's, well, only if you're doing these things initially, otherwise it's not.
Exactly. Yes. And that, I do really think that is a message that sort of has been lost in all of that. And even there we can get into, even when you look at, the papers that are doing, Brad has had really the luck of finally being able, doing the studies on trained individuals.
Yes.
And this is something, maybe this will kind of bring us back on topic an hour into this, starting about training across the career. We know that in beginners, everything works. It seriously doesn't make 3/5 of a difference what you have beginners do. Like within the differences are of such small magnitude, right? Whether you train at 50% of max or 90% of max, you get the same results. Whether you do 1 set or 3 sets, the results are essentially identical. Any gain from 3 sets, it's like 10% more gains in the short term. 2 days versus 3 days a week, the difference is you might get a little bit more strength depending on the population size. Like, this is always the problem with studies in untrained individuals. Mm-hmm. Everything works. And that, especially if you're looking at hypertrophy as an endpoint or even strength gains, most of it occurring in that first 6 to 8 weeks or thereabouts, it's mostly neurological. It's learning how to lift. And whether, multiple sets could be deemed superior because it gives you more practice, certainly. someone who's doing 5 sets or 3 sets of an exercise will probably learn it much more quickly than someone doing 1. But by and large, the gains there are being predominantly driven by, neurology in terms of it's not muscle fiber recruitment, but, just learning how to do the movement, coordination, all that stuff. It's actually interesting on that note, an odd little paper I came across that I think has been shown a couple times. Right, because what do we hear? If you're a beginner, focus on the big movements. Right? That's just de facto. And don't get me wrong, I think most people should probably learn those movements, but frequently they're not right for folks. And I'm sorry, but a lot of the quote-unquote big movements are, I think, crap for hypertrophy for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to write an article series. I've been planning it for a couple of years called Hypertrophy Heresy, and I'm going to basically crap on most of the big movements that I don't think for most are growth matters. But anyway, what this paper found is it looked at growth response to either a complex compound exercise versus a simple isolation movement. I think it was squats versus leg extension. Don't swear me to that. And what they found was that growth started sooner for the isolation movement. Well, why? You don't have to learn how to do it.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't do it. If I had a beginner who was just determined for me to work him over the first day, am I teaching him squats? No. I'm going to put him on the leg press and make him wish he'd never met me. I'll put him on the leg extension machine and make him want to die, because there is no learning. There is no motor learning to a leg extension. There is no motor learning to an arm curl. There is no motor learning to a pec deck. If you've got a beginning trainee and he's like, all right, I got 4 weeks. I need to gain as much muscle as I can. Pick the simplest isolation movements you can, because when the body doesn't have to go through neurological learning, growth starts sooner. Down the road, I think what also happened, I think in that study, I think the isolation group grew faster initially and then kind of slowed down, and then the compound movement started slow. You probably know the paper I'm talking about. It kind of picked up down the road, but it just kind of makes the point, and fine, do both. That gets into a whole separate argument about the paper showing that supposedly adding isolation movement doesn't increase growth, over whatever time period in beginners. But whatever. The point is, if you got 4 weeks and you need to get the most growth possible, you're better off not doing the complicated movements. And it may take me 3 weeks to get someone competent enough at a squat or a deadlift or a bench press to go particularly heavy. And I can do it day 1 on a pec deck. Or whatever. So you get into, I don't know why I started talking about this, something about beginner training and volume. Oh, right, we're talking about sort of volume and kind of figuring out the fundamental stuff in terms of, you've got a beginner and he wants, volume is king, we're going to do 2 sets. No. We need to start at jump ball.
Yep.
As a beginner, train as a beginner. So maybe that brings us sort of the full circle to, what constitutes proper beginner training? What are the goals here? Now, if you're a 15-year-old, 16-year-old male, the goal is simple. I want to get as big as possible to get girls. Let's just call it what it is. We all did it. It's not a criticism. It is what it is. Yes. That's whatever. There's a reason that, those magazines have been aimed at that population. Every day, there's a new 16-year-old kid who wants to get big to get girls. It doesn't work like that, guys, by the way. If only it did. So what do? They jump to advanced training. They jump into volume. They jump into what Arnold was doing at the peak of his career during his dieting phases or whatever. And, and I think we can generally agree that the goal of the beginner is, to develop consistency, work out, that sort of the nebulous stuff, is yes to learn. I do agree. I do think most people should probably learn the big movements to one degree or another. But part of that is also determining, are they right for you, right? A lot of what I think beginner training should be about is not only getting consistently into the gym and you have to strengthen connective tissue and bones and ligaments, and I still think connective tissue is the forgotten tissue. Yeah. We talk about all this. We talk about, training frequency and volume and this and that and the other. And that's great when all you're focusing on is muscles. What happens when I get tendinitis because my tendons are never getting a break because I'm benching 6 days a week? Now what? Right? There are other things that I think are frequently go unconsidered because we focus so much only on the muscular response. So as a beginner, you are having to get conditioned to regular training. A lot of that is motor learning, right? Is learning how to train, is learning how to do the movements properly, to learn what the muscles are doing, right? And I know even Brad's done some work, on sort of internal and, my muscle link, and Dave is kind of like, maybe not. And I'm like, yeah, I don't buy it. Like, I don't care that, you need to learn not only how to use the muscle in a given exercise, but to train it effectively, right? And heaving a barbell curl around doesn't accomplish that. Now, of course, people even turn that into either or. Oh, so what you're saying is I should just focus on squeezing the muscle. No, that's not what I'm saying. It's not an either or. I'm saying that progressive overload does not mean taking a strict concentrated barbell curl into that, right? You're using more weight. You're not stressing the muscle more.
Yeah.
Right. So that's another one that's turned to this goof ass either or thing. It's like, no. And I think, again, if you look at a lot of watch some of the big, there are guys heaving weights around that are big, but like, look at guys that have great backs. There are these big bodybuilders that are using beautiful form with heavy weights. Well, there's a lesson to that. Like, there's something to be learned from this, which is they learned how to do the exercises to train their muscles effectively, but not to the exclusion of progressive overload over time. It's by the time that they went from being able to do one wheel aside on the hammer row in perfect form to four wheels aside in perfect form, their backs were huge. But they spent the earlier part of their career figuring out how to fire the muscles effectively, and even what exercises fit your body best. I think this is something that also gets lost in the, squat or die or deadlift or die approach. The people who argue that are built for those movements by and large. And I still maintain that the only reason that still exists is because up until the 30s and 40s, there were no other options, right? I got a very silly article on my, there's a picture of a guy doing a leg press, laying on his back with a barbell hooked inside his boots. That's how you use the leg press, right? You would have to roll the bar. I kid you not, you roll on your back, you put your feet up, and you wore like a heeled boot, like a military boot, and you would roll the bar onto your legs, and you do a vertical leg press. But if you go way back, guys used to squat like that. Squat racks did not always exist. Literally, you would load a bar, tip it up on its end, you'd put it on your shoulder, you would roll it onto your back, squat, and then you would roll it off, right? Why aren't these hardcore knuckleheads, why not go back to that, right? Even then, people were trying to develop machines. The whole tradition of heavy barbell training, which I'm not against, don't get me wrong, is because that's all they had for most of the time. Many will find when they get out of that a properly made machine is maybe more effective for them from a growth response, right? Yes, if you're a power lifter, you have to squat. If you're an Olympic lifter, whatever, yes, and I'm not saying those are bad movements. I'm saying this idea that they are the be-all, end-all of training for all people is an extremist approach. For many people, if you have bad levers, if you have long femurs, or if you have whatever, if you have the mechanics of your squat are that you're going to be bent over doing a good morning, that is not a good leg exercise for you. And I don't give a shit what anybody has to say about that. It is not a good exercise for you. It's good for the people who are good at it. I've got short femurs. I can short squat very upright. It's a great leg movement for me. I'd still rather leg press because, well, I'm old and brittle. But regardless, it's like a lot of the beginning stages, that first 0 to 6 months is, yes, learning how to train consistently, learning to train intensely. Well, training intensely, that is a learned skill. This is something else I do think people forget, is you have to learn to exert yourself. Now, this depends on the person, right? The average 15-year-old knucklehead male, he'll go in and he'll probably just try to murder himself. But learning how to train intensely, it is a skill, especially to avoid your form breaking. This is all stuff that needs to happen progressively over that sort of beginner stage, right? So what I would say, the typical guidelines, although I recently saw someone recommend something, as a beginner, you don't need a bro split. You don't need a body part split. Everybody does that. Why? Well, that's what all these top pros do. They're hitting every muscle group once a week. That's not ideal to learn the exercise. you need more frequent exposure. If you're squatting once a week, you're only getting to practice that movement once, no matter how many. And if you do a lot of sets, you're probably doing a lot of very bad sets. If you're squatting 3 times a week or bench pressing or whatever the movement is, the more frequently you do it, the faster you'll learn it and the more quickly you'll get, and that's if you look at, we knew this for years. This was like the beginner program for a billion years. And then RHEA and the RHEA meta-analyses that looked at strength, and you're like, beginners should use an average intensity of 60% of max, train 3 times a week for anywhere from 1 to 3 sets. It's like, yep, fantastic. Like in that sense, the research said exactly what everybody kind of always knew. And I got and that's really how, as a beginner, I do think you should be training. Whatever exercise set you do, and some of that's trainee specific. If I'm working with a mid-30s woman, I'm probably going to use a machine setup. If she's got no previous movement background, if she has not, if she's already a little bit concerned or intimidated by the weight room, the last thing I need to do is give her an exercise she's going to not do well or be very self-conscious about doing. I'm not teaching a back squat out of the gate most of the time. Now, if I've got a 25-year-old ex-gymnast, and they're a joy to work with. If you ever work with people who've never been in the weight room but grew up doing like dance, gymnastics, any kind of movement stuff, they're easy. You just go shift your weight back 1/4 of an inch, and they know what that means. Like it's just because, but even that kind of goes to the point. Everything they did early in life has trained their nervous system, and that's really what we're doing, especially in the first couple of months of training. Right, so for beginner, let's focus on beginner males because let's face it, they're the ones who want to get big and jacked. That population, let's be realistic, 16 to 22-year-old males. Right, if they go in and just start doing a ton of sets with as much weight as they can, they've already screwed up. Right, they have basically missed a critical phase of training where they can make great progress doing very little. Right, because the studies show whether you're at 60% of one rep, which is something you can do probably 20 reps with, or 90%, you make the exact same gains. So you might as well use the lighter weights, use proper form, figure out, focus on what the muscle is doing, and I would say the same thing for any beginner, right? If I've got a 35-year-old woman who's never been the last thing I need you to do is beat her up her first day because she's never coming back. Not unless I get the check signed first. It's a joke, by the way. I know somebody that used to do that. I was like, how do you get them to come back after you beat up on them? It's like, you got their check. Oh, dude, just don't tell me that. But yeah, if you can get away with less, do it. If the gains from 1 set versus 3 sets are the same, the gains at 60% versus 90% are the same, do the lesser amount. And there's several reasons. One is just that practical sense of, it allows you to use a higher quality of training. If you're new to it, get broken in without breaking. Very important for beginners. I've got a series on my website called Training the Obese Beginner where I talk a lot about this. Also, there's more issues of exercise selection. There's things that I see 160-pound personal trainers, and they're like, I do walking lunges. I've been doing this for and they have a 300-pound overweight beginner, and I'm just like, oh my God, why are we failing our clients so badly? There's also the issue, and this gets into the volume thing, is, okay, fine, we can quibble on whether there's an upper limit of volume above which, supposedly it will Brad, well, there's research, I guess, forthcoming that may answer some questions we've had about upper limits of volume. Finally, because I admit a lot of the work that's been done is not at advanced trainees. We know that, even Brad's stuff is like, 10 plus sets per week. We didn't see an upper limit, but the data's not there.
Yeah.
Right? Is 20 too much? Is 30 too much? Where is it individual? Like, we know that there's a limit. There's got to be a limit somewhere, but we don't really know where it is. However, there's a practical limit frequently in terms of how long you can be in the gym having a life. And one thing that you see if you look at like long-term athlete development, like sports stuff, not bodybuilding, but like performance sports, that should give you some heck now. You know what I mean? Is they're like, if you use advanced methods, if you use high volume early on, okay, what do you do in 2 years? If as a beginner you're doing 20 sets per muscle group, well, when you plateau, now what?
Hi guys, thank you for listening to part 1 of this episode with Lyle McDonald. I hope you've enjoyed it. There is much more to come. As you know from Lyle, he has so much experience, so much to tell, and we have another episode coming for you shortly. Please, as always, if you can leave us a review, leave us any comments, leave us any kind words, that's always appreciated, and we will catch you soon. Revive stronger.